Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. Right, so today we finally get more information about Odin. We got the CCP release, and I actually have been binging a lot of that stuff up until this point, but we also got the early access bundles. And most of the time, vast majority of the time, I actually do like to go for these early access bundles, even if the champions are somewhat underwhelming. However, in this case, I will not be going for early access bundles, and I'm going to explain exactly why just before we actually get to dissecting everything that I do think about Odin and his potential relevance in the game. Now, I always say that buying crystals in this game is probably the worst investment per money that you can do. Typically, you can get a lot more value by even simply buying units and using them to clear content, or just buying some decently good offers, at the very least the ones that come out 4th of July and Cyber Weekend and stuff like that. However, if you are going to spend money on KABAMMED crystals, then without a doubt, these early access bundles typically are the time to do that, because you get 1000 extra 6-star shots and 3 of these 30% boosts, which are actually quite hard to come by regular means. However, with the Cavalier difficulty bundle that we are able to purchase by 3000 units every month, then even the boost value and relevance kind of has fallen, at the very least for me personally, because I have started grinding arena a slight amount, so I actually can just grind for that bundle, and then I don't have as big of a need for these 30% boosts. They're still always nice to have, but currently it just so happens that I'm actually fairly stocked up, and the fact that I'm not in a big need for these boosts right now, in combination with how Odin seems to be right now, and how little desire I actually have to play the character and mess about with him and try him out, I'm not going to be opening any crystals for him. Not now, not when they arrive in their full form, like next week when the arena starts. Just not that interested. Now, I will still probably grind for him as a 5-star champion, just because I grind for pretty much every champion now that I have a bit more time, but not because I think he's all that amazing. I do think, however, that every account probably should benefit from having access to some version of Odin, kind of like in a similar fashion that you never know when you're gonna need that Heimdall. Like, we all remember the disadvantage everybody was in 6.22 when Mr. Sinister Boss came about. Now, hopefully, if KABAMMED has learned anything from past, we will never see such a situation again where you need like a specific champion or specific champion combination to actually deal with troublesome content. But again, you never know when it's going to happen. However, I do not expect that to be very frequent occurrence at all. It's just something that you'd rather have at some point. But speaking of all the CCP information, I will actually be using notes from Cam, because Cam is definitely one of the voices in CCP that I typically like to listen to the most, and I not necessarily always agree with his conclusions, but I can definitely agree to his thought process and the way he builds up his arguments. So in the pros list, I'll be honest, there isn't all that much. Like, there's a lot written here. Realistically, the biggest pros about him would be that he has pre-fights, some decent synergies, and access to True Strike. But True Strike by itself does not a good champion make. What do I mean by that? Heimdall. Heimdall is a champion that has access to even more reliable True Strike buff. Basically, get to level 1 in any fight and don't get hit in the face, and that True Strike will remain and persist. Now, Odin True Strike can actually expire. And on top of that, if your Heimdall is awakened, then starting fight 2 and onwards, you can actually throw that level 1 off pretty much immediately, because you do gain a power gain buff based on the amount of buffs you had when you finished the previous fight. Therefore, if you use Heimdall for 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th fight, you can access that True Strike buff immediately. And it's, yeah, just better than Odin's and the way he accesses it, and the fact that Odin's one can expire. And yet Heimdall isn't an amazing champion. Heimdall isn't the champion that you go to when you need a True Strike champion. When you need to counter an auto block or an evade, nobody typically goes, I know what I'm going to use. I'm going to use Heimdall because he has amazing True Strike. Why? Because there's very, very little around that True Strike. there is very, very little damage and even less utility. Only thing that Heimdall can access, like pretty much any other Cosmic Champion that's been released within the last 3 years or so, is a whole bunch of buffs that do a whole little. And Odin seems to be quite similar. So, if not true strength, then what else? Okay, he has an armor buff. Wow, Heimdall does that too, by the way. But okay, so he has armor buff that can be situationally useful. Is there anything else? Not really, I'd like to say. Can you find anything? There are no damage over time debuffs, no armor breaks, there's no power control, very, very no immunities. So Odin is very bare by himself in a sense that just doesn't do all that much, but it's okay. Not every champion has to do a whole ton of things to be considered a great champion. For instance, Sunspot. Sunspot is loved by many players and he really doesn't have all that much going on. But even if you put Sunspot next to Odin, and keep in mind, Sunspot is a champion that's heavily criticized for his lack of utility, he still looks amazing next to Odin. Why? Because there's access to damage over time debuffs that can shut down opponents' healing with Despair Mastery. There's the perfect block that has been extremely important. That there is an increased power gain that you get by charging your heavy attack. And there is, most importantly, probably the main reason why Sunspot is liked and loved by many, crazy damage output. And then we also have immunity on Sunspot on top of it. So, for instance, when you put it next to Sunspot, who is a champion that I'm not overly impressed with. I don't think he's a bad champion, but I don't think he's like the best mutant class has to offer. And Odin looks quite pathetic, champion per champion basis. We're going to talk about the pre-fights and stuff like that afterwards, but here's one of the main things. Obviously, Sunspot kind of just beats Odin in most of the categories. But I think the one that really hurts the most Odin is the damage and that sleep mechanic. Because I was immediately worried about it and it read suspect on paper as it was. But I thought, in my ever so optimistic head, Odin's damage output is good to great when he's not rested. And then for one fight, he has insanely great damage output. I thought that would be something that we can live with and learn to work around with, because then it would be worth it. If he, on his base, with all of these buffs, with everything else that he can get, would be able to deliver a good, respectable damage output without having rested, and then we would have that innate bonus of him having in with those 2 massive furies, 7,000 starting attack as a maxed out 5-star. That sounded potentially insanely amazing. But unfortunately, due to the lack of base stats and due to the lack of other kind of like damage increasing abilities, you would say, it's just not. His damage when he's not rested is awful. Somebody that you would never really want to use under any circumstances. And then the damage when he's rested, as in like 1/3 of a time throughout the quest, can be alright. He's still nowhere close to the level of higher damage dealing champions. It's not damage that you see on Sunspot, Ghost, Cosmic Ghost Rider. It's not damage that you can see on Colossus and a whole bunch of other champions in the game. So we're currently talking about a champion who, at its best, is still steps behind, and on top of that is very high maintenance. And then there are a lot of other innate weaknesses that you must be able to access your power and spam your special attacks and etc, etc. No immunities and no suicide friendliness, and it's just a whole plethora of reasons why not to like this guy, not to use this guy. And therefore, as far as Odin, the champion, is concerned, I am absolutely uninterested. I think Heimdall probably looks more promising. Maybe he isn't, but I would see more reasons to kind of like bring in Heimdall than Odin by himself, quite honestly, because of the fact that Heimdall can access the True Strike earlier from fight number 2, and yeah, it's just what it is. Okay, Odin rested definitely is going to be better than Heimdall though, but we'll keep that there. And then that obviously leads us to his pre-fight abilities and things that he can do for other champions. And there are obviously implications where, and there are situations where you will probably want to have access Odin. But the question is, how often do we think they're going to come by? And whether his pre-fight ability is going to have major impact on Alliance War. I personally do not really quite think so, because fitting, like let's say in a generic situation, you have ability to give pseudo shock immunity to a champion. So you can bring in one champion and make him pseudo shock immune. In most of the cases, probably the wiser play would be if you have the roster and if you have the options to bring in just 2 shock immune champions and you have actually 2 champions to play with. In case one gets KO'd, you can use the other one instead of having Odin, who's effectively just a dead weight to the team. Now, obviously, there can be situations that will happen potentially in future where, just like with Heimdall, people who don't have him will have much harder time countering a fight. But hopefully KABAMMED has learned from that in the past, and the indication has been that we will not see fights like that added to the contest. We will not likely going to have another Mr. Sinister situation, because KABAMMED has redone their approach to the hardest content in the game. So I do not think that there is a very high likelihood of some very big roadblock coming along the way where Odin is the only answer. Maybe I'm wrong, obviously I can't predict the future, but I just don't think it's likely to happen. And that leaves us with the biggest thing, obviously, Alliance War. But again, keep in mind, Alliance War, you can only bring in 3 champions, and quite often that is hardly enough. And your officers have quite hard time on kind of like planning the fights and planning the lanes so that everybody has counters for everything that you need. And when it comes to what I think Odin's impact is going to be on Alliance Wars, it's more than likely is going to be the similar level of Mr. Fantastic and similar level of White Magneto, where, yeah, we're probably going to see somebody bring in Odin to Alliance War semi-frequently and use the pre-fights to enhance the champions of your teammate, potentially give you some better answers for some trickier fights. But if you think about it, there aren't that many fights where the champion would require shock immunity. Right? There's one EMP modification node on the lane, and other than that, there's hardly any, if any, shock nodes or champions who just randomly throw shock on you. At the very least, they're typically not like the hardest defender. Maybe I'm blanking on a fight, but I just don't see where not having a shock immunity is a deal breaker to a fight in most cases. And then there is the damage cap. But even as a 6-star champion, the damage cap still will permit you to take some 75% of the damage per combo if it's a 5-hit combo, but if it's a 6-hit combo, it goes back up to 90%, and if it inflicts damage over time, you're dead. So I don't think it's really as big of a safety net as people think it is. So I genuinely think that when it comes to Alliance War, White Magneto and Mr. Fantastic are probably more influential and more useful champions to have than Odin. But again, I might be wrong. So, as it currently stands, I have very little to no interest in this champion. Unfortunately, I do not think KABAMMED has done justice to him. And I might change my mind pending some future developments. Hela Synergy seems like a very cool one for Hela. And even though I don't think it's going to be very practical in most cases, I do think that there might be a potential to bring in Odin and Hela, like a duo, for Abyss spots, if you can counter the rest of the fights in other champions. So I think that would be quite interesting to see. Like a maxed out 5-star Hela in Abyss with Odin might be one of the more decent answers to some generic fights. So I'd like to see that definitely. But outside of that, I just don't think there is all that much to talk about when it comes to Odin. So let me know what you think. I will leave a link to Cam's video in the description, but on a personal note, yes, I do not think Odin deserves any of my money, and at best I will pick him up as a 5-star in Arena for free, and maybe, pending some new developments, he can reignite my interest in him, but currently I just don't particularly care for this champion. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I'm gonna catch you guys soon. See ya. proceed with... Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about the